How's it going? I got this whiteboard so I could teach through visual examples. I know that a lot of the times I'm speaking Chinese in my videos because people are, I don't want to say ignorantly they lack knowledge, but the knowledge they do have, they don't exercise. So if somebody has an high IQ and doesn't use it, that is the most unintelligent thing. So I make that example as if you have documentation, if you have evidence on anything regarding Minnesota Mdewakanton, or you see what I post or what Carl posts or other elders post, our ancestors went through too much for us to sit here and not know what they did, and then let alone not exercise the authority that they participated in the 1800s. So we have the main tribe, the Minnesota Mdewakanton. This would be considered the historic tribe. This is the historic tribe, the treaty signing tribe, along with the other three bands of the Dakota. The three bands, Mdewakanton, Wapakute, Sisseton, Wahpeton. Okay, so now with this band being established because of the loyalists that did not participate in the Dakota Uprising War, if they canceled the treaties because of the war, then the state is owned by the four Dakota bands south of the Mississippi going down into Iowa and partially in South Dakota. So they could not legally terminate the treaty. So they made the Acts of Congress in 1863. There was 2 acts, and that refers to the loyal Sioux. The loyal. And the loyals would declare themselves as a loyalist because in the 1800s, the late 1800s, 1882, I believe, through 1891 is when acts are being established with appropriations, purchasing of lands, because the February and the March Act of 1863 says anybody who declares themselves as a loyalist is entitled to 80 acres. So that goes to 80 acres. So now we have these appropriations. It's different for the other Dakota bands. So now that we know what established the Minnesota Mdewakanton, now there are 3 bands. There's the Birch, Coulee band, the Birch Coulee band, the Prairie Island band, and then the Prior Lake. They were not considered Shakopee until the organization of Shakopee, Mdewakanton, Sioux. So there's the Prior Lake band. So these are the existing federally recognized communities that are the lineal descendants of the Minnesota Mdewakanton. Each established a corporate charter, all of them corporate charter, corporate charter. So a corporate charter is a business entity, a business council, you would say, of Section 16 and 17 of the 1934 IRA Act. I hope you're taking your notes right now. So the 1934 Act, under Section 16 and 17, these 3 communities were able to form. They were able to form and create bylaws and constitutions of the law, the supreme law of their community. So now that we know this, we can go back to the top, which is the Minnesota Mdewakanton. Members from Upper Sioux and Lower Sioux during 1934 and 1935 voted for the Minnesota Mdewakanton to be established under IRA. Because the three earlier bands that I just mentioned, those were lands that were appropriated by the funds of the 1888 through 1891. Those funds purchased Minnesota Mdewakanton land. This land was purchased in 1905 when records show evidence of the first purchase for Minnesota Mdewakanton land. So a group recognized by Congress and the Secretary of Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs understood that the Minnesota Mdewakanton had reservation land under federal jurisdiction prior to the 1934 Act. Without the Minnesota Mdewakanton, here we'll just use a box for example. Here's the 86 land in Redwood County. Here's the 86 land in Goodhue County. Here's the 1886 land in Scott County, and then 1886 land in Hastings County. These four boxes represent the allotment that was assigned to the allottee. And these were without present current jurisdiction of Prairie Island and Lower Sioux. So these groups were not able to organize without having the descent of Minnesota Mdewakanton and also the land base of the Minnesota Mdewakanton. Okay, so when we're talking about the 1934 Act, there's a confusion because there's reference as this is a federally recognized Indian community because of the 1934 Act. The 1934 Act, many sections can label you as IRA, identify you as IRA. Do you inherit the full 1934 Act, the subject matters of the 1934 IRA Act? No, and that's why we can see Congress right now is terminating tribes that went through federal acknowledgement or that were federally recognized by 1934 IRA was because these communities are acting as such corporate charters, not as IRA communities. How could a corporate charter exist if there is no historic tribe that ties their lineage to a historic tribe? So if the Minnesota Mdewakanton don't exist, the three communities don't exist. They would need the Minnesota Mdewakanton to be federally recognized, which was an event in 1934 and 1935. William Zimmerman. Zimmerman wrote to the Secretary of Interior reports on voting ballots, meeting discussions, because as I was saying that from Upper Sioux and Lower Sioux, even though Upper Sioux is not Mdewakanton, that is Sisseton, Wahpeton, they still had affiliation with Mdewakanton land illegally, whatever we want to call it. So there was a vote for this group to be federally recognized. So why are we trying to look into federal acknowledgement when we already exist as of 1934 IRA tribe? 1934 IRA tribe. Now this group as I referred to the Minnesota Mdewakanton as a political body, never exercised the authority as an IRA community should. These three communities are the disguised forms of the Minnesota Mdewakanton, though the lineal descendants of these communities descend from this political body has never been exercised until now. And that calls for a secretarial election. Secretary of Interior holds an election. So this body can exercise its authority of lands that, see, when land certificates were being issued, there was no jurisdiction behind it. Not until after 1934, you simply occupied the land, being the loyalist you are. And the appropriation funds was the funding sources for farming equipment, agricultural seeds, horses, etc., to be able to practice self-determination and maintain and preserve these 86 lands. 1886 lands, there are 1,100 acres. And this isn't including when Lower Sioux and Prairie Island got additional acreage after forming as Section 1617 corporate charter IRA communities. So now what do we do? Because we can see that there was a time, and the time is still now, where Minnesota Mdewakanton lands were being issued before 1934. So the fee land and the trust acquisition IRA communities do nowadays, the Minnesota Mdewakanton are fairly different. I'm sure there's other tribes around the nation that can have a similar structure as being loyalists to the United States during wars or being loyal to the British. But with the Minnesota Mdewakanton, what's interesting is that there was reservation lands held in trust by the United States for lineal descendants that were not, you would say, IRA formed or recognized communities. But the Minnesota Mdewakanton are still recognized by 1934. So any money coming from, again, here's the 4 boxes. This is 86 land, 86 land, 86 land, 86 land. So Redwood, Goodhue, Scott, and Dakota. And I would like to thank Carl for making the maps to visualize. That's a big reason why I'm able to understand this, is because of the maps Carl has created. So I'd like to thank you, Carl. So these are the 1,100 acres. Now, other than Dakota County, these 386 lands fall in the geographical location of Shakopee, Mdewakanton Sioux Community, Prairie Island Indian Community, and Redwood. So I'll actually fix this mistake. This is Redwood. So we can see that people had Indian land certificates prior to being enrolled with one of these communities. So these lands obviously are different than what these communities have purchased with time. So there's still these lands, and then Diane Rosen, who I guess died a few years, but in 2012, before she resigned, there was a discussion about the 1980 Act. The 1980 Act, which was that with the respect of these 3 communities, SMSC, Prairie Island, and Lower Sioux. With the respect of these communities, the land that were 86 lands were held in trust for them. Held in trust. So you got the 86 land for them, which is 250 some acres. For Prairie Island, which is, I believe, 500 and some acres. And look at the 1980 Act. It has the exact acreage. I don't have it in front of me. So let's just say 500 acres, 250 acres, and then Lower Sioux with it's either 800 or 900, something like that. Rough estimate. So the 1980 Act says, with the respect of these three communities, 1886 lands are held in trust for them. What was their responsibility with that trust land authorizing act for these communities to have anything to do with these 86 lands? Because the communities believe that they own the lands because of this act, but then Diane Rosen, going back to her, she proved with the 1980 Act, nothing in it said that the money that was made from these three locations of 1886 lands, the money driven from these lands are placed in the Minnesota Mdewakanton account. And that's what Judge Lettle ruled on, that there was a judgment fund award for those who could prove descendancy either through 1886 or Indian land certificates, which a lot of people were not able to prove during that lawsuit of Wolfchild. And even though Wolfchild, that lawsuit was claiming to be Minnesota Mdewakanton, a lot of them weren't Minnesota Mdewakanton, or they had affiliation with another tribe. They're enrolled with a new tribe. A lot of us Dakota Sioux or Lakota Sioux present day consist of multiple bands of the Dakota. And that's still a genocide way of thinking, because we never, these bands of Dakota the government refers to does not identify them as a nationality, rather than that we're all related and these were different villages. And the village was named after the land location or any other Dakota language or Lakota language that was edited, similar to like Old English and Modern English. It's the same language, just different ways of, I don't want to say pronouncing, but you know what I'm talking about. So anyway, the money coming from these lands. So why would they set it up where 86 lands held in trust by these corporate charter communities? Why would the money, because again, a lot of their economic sources do not lie on 86 lands, but some do. So why would they be paying a lease to the BIA? They're paying a lease to BIA. If you're paying a lease, that doesn't mean you own it. If I'm renting this house, that doesn't mean that I own it. I'm renting it from the owner. So the owner is the Minnesota Mdewakanton. Okay, so that, and they divided into three different bands. Now, the federally recognized communities is what represents those three bands, you would say. So why would, and I made that video before, but why would there still be an account existing for the Minnesota Mdewakanton if the Minnesota Mdewakanton aren't an acknowledged group throughout history? Well, that's what you would think, but I found out that they are. And with that Minnesota Mdewakanton account, whoever came up with the idea, whether if it's Special Indian Agents or Commissioner of Indian Affairs or the Secretary of Interior, somewhere, somebody, some whom, and I know William Zimmerman was a huge advocate for this theory that I'm going to present right now, is that what happens when these lands that were appropriated become overpopulated. Populated, if I spelled populated right. What happens if they're overpopulated? Well, that's a good idea because a lot of these, a lot of people are neighbors with their family, and there's limited land, and these 3 IRA communities offer IRA land assignments that are nothing to do with trust land status as Minnesota Mdewakanton land. The new land is a tribal asset of the 3 communities, not a Minnesota Mdewakanton asset. Though it could be, but I'll go into that in another video why. But the account is to purchase more land, additional land, to expand the Birch Coulee Band's reservation, to expand the Prairie Islands Band's reservation, to expand the Prairie, the Prairie Lake Band's reservation. So we are repeating history from when land was purchased, these 4 locations that are 1,100 acres. Now we are using that account to purchase for more land. And I just put a big box because there's a lot of land that we need for landless Mdewakanton. Landless Mdewakanton, unenrolled Mdewakanton, or Mdewakanton that are enrolled into these 3 corporate charters, and they show existence of occupying 1886 land. And what do I mean by that? Because a lot of people have not occupied Indian land certificates for decades or never throughout their family history. So that's where the 1980 Act was saying any assignment prior to 1980, those lands aren't held in trust with the respect of that community. That assignment is still, because prior to 1980, Indian land certificates were held in trust by the Secretary of Interior. Now you can see that land assignments are held in trust by the community for whoever signs up on the priority land list. Anybody who signs up, so that is a conflict of the acts of Congress that established Minnesota Mdewakanton land assignments. But we have families that exist prior to 1980 who were assigned land. But these lands are getting overpopulated, like I said. And so for us to use the land purchase for the children, this is what needs to be done. This is what we're doing to clear up the confusion. This has nothing to do with the 3 communities. We're expanding our family reservation land. And people who had an Indian land certificate prior to 1980, some of these people, actually all of the people, I guess you would say, had their certificate before the community was even established. Like my grandfather, John Cermak, he had his Indian land certificate from William Zimmerman, red sealed, in Washington, D.C. That was in 1944. So 1944, Grandpa had 50 acres. He had 50 acres. He was a base enrollee in 1969, so he was one of the constitutional signers and founders. I believe there was 12 or 13 original members. He was one of them, one of 13. Now his children, the only child he had 12 children, or 10 or 12 children. Only one of them is enrolled in 1969, his son Ed. But then his son, Milo, my grandpa, had 80 acres of Minnesota Mdewakanton land in the 50s and then abandoned the land. John did not abandon the land. He died. Ed moved on to it. Then from Ed's death, the community felt as, now this is our land base that we can utilize. though that land is entitled to immediate possession of his heirs, that was the legal language. Even if there's a will saying, this is my favorite child, I want my favorite child to have it, that still is, it still conflicts the his or her heirs. It doesn't say heirs that had a will could live on the assignment or would be reassigned to them. So this was a broad history lesson, a quick summary of what we're doing, what is true, what is history, and what established of these communities today. There is a lot more that established these communities, and I do not take the credit for the other parts and aspects, and I'm just trying to make this video short. It's already 25 minutes long, but there was a lot obviously added to make these communities. So there would be a video I would make that would be longer, obviously explaining that. But in short, summary, practical terms, this is what was established. This was the quick summary. Anybody who wants to contribute, finds this interesting, this is the time now, because we are issuing out 80 acres to heads of families and building economic sources and social programs, welfare programs, residential housing programs. We do not want anybody to feel as they are left out. And it's important for us because a lot of people contact me. We're getting the resources to help you more efficiently. So we will be getting back to you shortly. It is Demon Knight. Thank you for watching.